Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for that marvellous introduction from Jeremy. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to live up to that, so I hope everybody's awake in the graveyard shift. So in my presentation today, we're going to have a look at the managing PCI throughout the year and looking at actually what we need to do to be able to achieve that. As Jeremy said, my name is Paul Brennecker. I'm the head of consulting at 3D Data Security, and I'm one of those unfortunate individuals that's been a QSA for the last 15 years. So hopefully I've got a little bit of sort of anecdotal evidence in the tank that I can help inform things with this afternoon. So we know PCI version 4. We've been talking about it for the last 2 days, and I'm sure everybody's PCI version 4'd out a little bit. I'll try not to labour too much on the points of the individual requirements. We won't go into that sort of level of detail. Try and keep things a little bit generic. But we know that PCI version 4 does bring a slightly different approach. And it concentrates more on regular security checks in many different areas. We're moving away from that annual compliance check, as Jeremy just said. It's an ongoing process we need to do. It's not that annual check, once a year thing, get the QSA in, sign off the SAQ. It brings the added advantage that the environment being assessed is stepping up its security posture considerably. And that can also be really beneficial from a business point of view. When we're looking at GRC, at governance, risk and compliance, we can see that this approach with PCI really aligns really neatly. And demonstrating a better security management framework on which you can build things also brings other benefits to the business, possibly things like reduction in cyber insurance premiums, increase confidence in the business, and potentially adding value to the business for shareholders as well. Many different things that can come along with that. And PCI is all one thing that can add into that. The nice thing about PCI compliance is, at the end of it, when you're compliant, attestation of compliance, you've got your certificate almost, haven't you, to prove that you've achieved something. And obviously that's a really valuable thing to have. So, security is a continuous process. Let's have a look at GRC and exactly how PCI ties into that. So when we align the procedures and actions with a business plan and the business goals, we can increase efficiency and add value. Managing risk is obviously an important thing to every business in this day and age, and we can assess what those risks are, and we can score them and treat them. And they can be treated in a measured way. Some risks may be acceptable to the business, and some risks obviously need to be treated. So having a process to highlight what those risks are is really, really important, and PCI can also help with that too, when we're looking at our payment environment. So other risks may also come to light while we're doing our PCI compliance work throughout the year. We might want to have a look at how the business processes card data. We've talked a bit about the pandemic, I'm sure, in the last couple of days, and that obviously introduced a whole new risk picture for many, many businesses. And certainly when we were doing our QSA work, we were often having sort of hurried conversations with our clients saying, all of a sudden our work base, our staff are all working from home. They're taking calls, they're taking payments over the phone from a home network. How has that affected our compliance, and how has it affected our risk stance? So there's all things that always obviously have to come into play when we're looking at the whole GRC picture. Compliance is a way in which we can assess that security posture, and it can be validated and documented. Obviously, the PCI compliance certificate, like I say, the AOC, is something that can be provided to people like the insurance brokers when you're talking about the cyber insurance premiums for a business. So PCI version 4. Let's go back to basics a little bit and talk about version 4 and where we've been on a journey. I've seen many, many faces I recognise over the sort of 15 or so more years that I've been coming to these events. It's hard to believe that PCI as a standard is approaching its 20th birthday. I was involved in it almost pretty much from the start in my days of working for an acquirer. The initial version of the standard, as we know, has gone through many, many iterations. Let's just have a little think about what was happening when PCI was launched. We used Ask Jeeves as a search engine. Whatever happened to that gentleman? Apple hadn't even launched its first MacBook. Twitter was still 2 years away from coming into being, and Facebook was a germ of an idea for a social media study by a Harvard university student. We wouldn't specifically like to say which university student it was. We're not going to go down that route. But threats have evolved in much the same way as technology has evolved, and the standard has obviously tried to stay current with those threats. And obviously, it's no mean feat. And I think version 4 is a real gear shift in a way, and moves things forward in a fantastic way to address the threats that we're currently seeing. We've talked about the global pandemic as well, and that's obviously changed the way in which we work and the way in which we shop, and to an extent, the way in which we socialize. It's interesting that nowadays, it's quite common for us to have Teams meetings, Zoom meetings with friends and family as well as at work. So things certainly have changed in that respect. And also the use of cash. I heard somebody else yesterday talking about how the pandemic has really changed the way that we use cards in many, many different areas of the world. And that's obviously had a massive effect on our risk stance within all the businesses as well. So, evolving controls, that's what version 4 is all about. And it's obviously, as I say, it's moved things forward very much. Controls have evolved by analysing the details of payment forensics investigations. Trends in which merchant channels and platforms and methods in which compromises have been seen have been analysed over the years, and obviously we've got almost 20 years worth of data to look at now to help grow things and evolve things. Often things are regional. In Europe, we've had very, very low customer present fraud for quite some time due to the early adoption of EMV. In North America, things are slightly different, although the pandemic again has moved things forward in that respect. So controls can certainly be developed to help address these evolving threats, and we can quite clearly see that in version 4. So we'll have a quick look at some of the changes to the controls that are required, and we'll have a specific focus on e-commerce environments, because I think they're the ones that actually the changes are going to be quite significant for anybody that's running an e-commerce website. Taking ownership. So those of you that have had a look at PCI version 4, I'm sure everybody's read it cover to cover. One thing you will notice is that particular statement up there. Roles and responsibilities for performing activities and requirement 1 through 12 are documented, assigned, and understood. And that crops up in every single requirement. It's important to assign and document who will be performing each task and make sure that that person is aware of what they need to do to fulfill that role, and also to make sure that they understand what needs to be done. Training's a really important thing to ensure that staff are given the tools that they need to do the jobs properly. And it's only by doing that, by assigning the responsibility, doing the activity, making sure that you're aware of what needs to be done, that we actually knit that all together into a proper security risk management program. Sometimes it can be appropriate to assign tasks as key roles for an individual. For instance, like a scene manager may potentially need to review reports and alerts and things as they are generated, and they need to understand exactly what they are. We need to make sure that the tasks don't stop when somebody leaves the business or somebody changes roles. One of the things we see as a QSA quite often is, I don't know who does that, we just set it up. Or, oh yeah, Joe used to do that, but he's left the business now. I'm not sure who's picked it up. So making sure that those things are, catered for when we're looking at assigning ownership of particular tasks are really important. And also, one thing just to bear in mind with that, be careful that we don't create single points of failure, because we see that very, very often in businesses too. It's one person's responsibility. They set a process up, they understand it, they own it, and they've left. And nobody else can pick it up. They don't understand the software, they don't understand the package. Documentation changes is another interesting area that we need to have a look at for version 4 as well. Good security practice means keeping good documentation. We need to make sure that the way in which payment card information is processed is retained and documented fully. It's another new requirement. We've been saying for a few years now that having a card payment strategy is a really, really good way of sort of encapsulating how a business works. And this version 4 really, really encourages that. Documenting how payments are taken in all channels is really important. So you know how you have an authorized method for face-to-face transactions, an authorized payment gateway for e-commerce, and an authorized sort of system for any telephone orders that you might process. And when a new service appears, refer to that and say, actually, does that fit in? Can we use one of the technologies we already use because we want to adopt a new technology in the business? If it's not there, a risk assessment might be necessary on any new methods that potentially pop up in the business. Once the risk assessment's done, it can then be added into the payment strategy, and away we go. In addition to that, we've got to have retention requirements for data. And that's another thing that now crops up in that SAQA for e-commerce merchants. Outsourcing the processing of data, that's fine, but we still have to have it documented to say, actually, we don't want to store any card data. We're going to let our third parties do that. It's not just good enough just to say that anymore. We have to have that documented and actually down it in, in a simple procedure document that we can refer to, part and parcel of that payment strategy. A secure process for deletion of any data that you might come across is also required. Needs to be perhaps a monthly task to make sure just nothing is being retained that shouldn't be retained. And how can we verify that when data is deleted, how can we verify that it's been done properly? It's something else that we want to include in that process too. Might be worth thinking about whether card data discovery is worth looking at too, to make sure that no data is leaked out of the environment and is being stored anywhere perhaps where it shouldn't. That can obviously help when it comes to assessment time because you can prove what you've done. Maintenance of the environment, another very important thing. I've seen some interesting presentations over the last couple of days about doing exactly that, patching, keeping environments up to date. It's obviously a good practice to keep on top of patching. Version 4 very much encourages that as well. It's a good time to look at automation potentially of that if you haven't already automated it. It's wise to factor in the whole vulnerability management process around the patching cycle, alternating patching, monthly patching with monthly vulnerability assessments, the whole plan, check, do, repeat, do all that on a sort of a monthly basis. And then once you do that throughout the year, you've actually got something that you can validate and show that you're doing the process properly. Systems with insecure software and security flaws and unpatched systems are one of the most common reasons for security breaches, something that we see in our PFI team very regularly. So maximum effort is going to be required just to keep on top of that and make sure that things are maintained throughout the year. Critical patches, apply them within 1 month of release. With version 4, it's a requirement for an effective patch management system, and that obviously now applies to the SAQA merchants as well, so the e-commerce merchants with outsourced payment processing. Outsourcing your payment process from your hosted environment is no longer an excuse to forget about patching. Again, that was something that we used to see an awful lot. An e-commerce website would get set up, appropriate gateway would be plugged in at the back end, and that was it. It would be never touched again. Lo and behold, compromises would soon start to come knocking at the door. There are still a significantly high number of websites that have outsourced payments that are being compromised, and man-in-the-middle attacks are being launched and seen almost on a daily basis. So, on to some of the brand new challenges. We've talked about scripts. I'm not going to go into the details because I know you've looked at JavaScript sort of work already today. I saw John's presentation, which was fascinating earlier on. Just to reiterate that a little bit, off-the-shelf JavaScript malware is available, as I'm sure you're aware, certainly for the big content management systems that we see. And that's something that needs to happen. We need to address that as a problem. It's important to know what scripts are running on the website, and it's important to know what's happening at that checkout process. Obviously the local scripts and third-party scripts as well, it all comes into the same bundle. We need to be aware of what's happening. We need to manage it. An inventory of those scripts is essential when it means that we have to identify each one. There are various tools and methods that you can use to do that, and they can be used to dynamically list out the scripts. We need to make sure that each of those scripts are monitored and any changes are identified using an integrity check. Now, one of the things that perhaps hasn't registered, where have those scripts come from? Who's responsible for them? They might have come from various different teams within the department. They might be the marketing team. They might be the customer experience team that have requested some analytical data to come back off the website. So actually finding the owners for them can be an initial first challenge that we need to have a look at. But we need to know that each of those scripts is known and validated and has a valid business purpose for them. So SAQA merchants will also be required to have external ASV scans done. That's something new again to the e-commerce sort of platform. We need to make sure that we're running those quarterly. So that process can be synchronized with each of the patch management procedures that we talked about earlier on, that whole plan, do, check, repeat thing. The PCI 4 requirement is still to have them done quarterly. As a QSA, we quite often recommend that people look at doing that monthly. It saves bunching everything up and doing a whole sort of big release once a quarter. Do it in bite-sized chunks. Little and often, as your mother would say. That's certainly the maxim here. So, change detection. Another thing that we need to have a look at. Another thing that's come into scope for PCI SAQA merchants. Integrity of critical files on a website needs to be monitored on a regular basis. And again, this is all coming back from data that's been collected as part and parcel of some of the PFI cases that we've seen. It's especially important when using iframes to connect to payment gateway. We know that there's ways of breaking out of that process, and being aware of that and being able to spot when that's happening is really, really important now. The integrity of that connection is vital. So set up monitoring, and if it changes without authority, you know that it needs to be investigated immediately. Many historic website compromises could have been detected very early on with some change detection technologies on the web hosts. So that's a really good call, I think, for version 4, that we're now looking at that for e-commerce environments. Third-party management, following on from my a friend who was doing the presentation just before me, just to reiterate his points about managing third parties properly, really, really important. It's important that technical checks are there in the way in which we outsource process to third parties as well. In some cases, it can include 100% of the card processing environment being outsourced to a third party. So it needs careful management of that process and regular reviews of it to make sure that it's working properly. One of the ways in which you can do that is by using a responsibility matrix. I'm sure that's something that you've heard mentioned about. It's not mandated in the standard, but it's a very, very good way of meeting requirement 12. Documenting who's responsible for which particular control. What we don't want is any of those controls to fall between the cracks. So you think the third party's doing it, the third party aren't doing it, and nobody ends up patching a system or providing updates to applications. It should be monitored with regular service review meetings and performance indicators. The key rule to managing third parties throughout the year. This is a comment that I've used for the last 15 years as a QSA. You can outsource anything and everything apart from your responsibility to manage things properly. It shouldn't be a sign the contract and forget about it scenario. Appoint a service manager for any contract that involves payment card processing. And as we know, making it part of their role, as we've talked about, assigning roles and responsibilities, really, really important and a good way to ensure that it gets attention throughout the year, rather than once a year as part and parcel of the compliance check. So, to summarize, changes that we're looking at within PCI version 4 are based on real-life scenarios, real-life incidents and compromises that have happened in the past. And as I say, we've got 20 years worth of data to look back on. The changes all focus on continual management of the security of the environment, and that's obviously a really, really good thing, moving away from that once-a-year compliance check into a continuous process throughout the year. We need to make sure that that whole false sense of security thing in that, we're PCI compliant, we don't need to worry about that obviously, false sense of security, we can't rely on that anymore. We need to make sure that it's managed properly throughout the year. It has led to complacency in the past, and sometimes, when entities have had compromises, it's come as a complete shock. They thought they were PCI compliant, but in actual fact, they haven't looked at it for 11 months. So, that's me done. That's very much a whistle-stop tour of ongoing security management. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks very much for your attention. As I've mentioned, a lot of the things that have been included in this have been based on observations that we've made through doing some of our QSA and PFI work and working within the areas of payment fraud and forensic analysis. I've been Paul Brennecker. If you need to catch up with me and ask me any questions, you'll find us hanging around in the vendor showcase, no doubt. Great to speak to you all, and hope to speak to you all sometime soon.